Shabbat Shalom. So this is a scene I can picture. The descendants of Reuben and Gad are there, just on the east side of the Jordan River, with all the other Israelites. And they and Moses and all the 12 tribes and their descendants, they're there ready to cross the promised land. They're preparing themselves. They're just on the east side of Jordan. They can see just over. Moses, we know, will die, and Joshua will be the one to lead our ancestors. But just before that happens, the leaders of the tribes of Reuben and Gad, they go up to Moses. And in my head, they kind of, Mo, because they were very close. They'd spent 40 years together. Mo, we were thinking, it's really comfortable for us outside the land of Israel. Business is going really well. Okay, they had cattle. Business is going really well. We're comfortable. It's easy. This is kind of a nice life here outside the land of Israel. Do you mind if we stay? We know you're going to go, and we know we've been talking about Israel, and we know it's beautiful and wonderful and great there, and it's the Holy Land, but it's kind of nice for us out here. Do you mind if we stay? Moses gives them a spiel. Are you kidding me? 400 years of slavery, 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Your parents died because they didn't want to enter the promised land 38 years ago. And now, you want the same thing? Mo, it's really kind of nice. So Moses says to the leaders of Reuben and Gad, we'll strike you a deal. If you come forward as shock troops, you lead the armies in reclaiming the land of Israel, and you stay and help us reclaim until all the land is reclaimed, then yes, you can stay there outside the land of Israel while your brothers and sisters go and do the hard work of building the land. I was thinking about that a lot the last few weeks, especially with you giving me the opportunity to continue my fellowship of learning in Israel. It's really kind of nice here outside the land. Business is good. We're comfortable. We're successful. Why do we have to dirty our hands with the hard work of building the land? And I was especially thinking about that in my role as a North American Jew. As we came to the conversation at hand for this summer's fellowship of the Shalom Hartman Institute. And the question that guided our studies throughout these several weeks, why Israel? Why Israel? That was a question that our teachers asked us as we delved into incredible studies of texts, ancient and modern. Why Israel? Now, of course, as I was engaged in my learning, the first thing that occurred to me was, what a silly question. Why Israel? There's already an Israel. What do we need to ask why Israel? Israelis aren't asking why Israel. Israelis are saying, why is food so expensive? Israelis are saying, why is housing so ridiculously expensive? And Israelis are saying, we're really proud of our democracy. We're proud we're a strong democracy, but do we really need an election every year? Right? Israelis are worrying about the corruption of their political system. That's what Israelis are worried about. But we North American Jews, what are we worried about? Why Israel? And why are we asking the question, why Israel? Because our children and our grandchildren are saying, this Israel project you've been working on for so long, it's not speaking to us. Mom and Dad, Grandma and Grandpa, Bubby, Zadie, you raised us to believe that we can all just live together in peace. You raised us with universal Jewish values. You raised us to say that if we really work hard, we can all just get along and live happily ever after. You raised us with a strong commitment to human rights and morality and loving our neighbors as ourselves. You raised us with a commitment to liberty and liberalism and democracy. And this Israel thing, is it really going how you want it to go? When I give them the benefit of the doubt, that's what I hear them saying. When they ask the question, why Israel? Now, for me, I'm like the tribes of Reuben and Gad. I recognize how easy it is for me outside the land of Israel. And I approach the question of why Israel with a tremendous sense of humility, because at the end of the day, I'm not putting on a uniform and carrying a gun. At the end of the day, I'm not asking my children to do that either. And so I pursue the question of why Israel with a great deal of humility, as I think everyone who doesn't live in Israel must do. Why Israel is a hard question. And in some ways, who am I to be asking the question? The answer, of course, is we're Jews. And while it's not just as much my country as it is the Israelis, it is my homeland. It is our promised land. And so as we think about the question, why Israel, the first answer that comes to my mind is the same reason that was given to our ancestors 3,500 years ago, and the same reason that our ancestors 100 years ago pursued the state of Israel, and the same reason why it was so important to us in 1945. Why Israel? Because of the Holocaust. Why Israel? Because of anti-Semitism. Why Israel? Because we know what happens when there isn't a Jewish army protecting Jewish people in the Jewish land. We know what happens. Why Israel? Because we suffer when there is no Israel. That's why Israel. And so more than anything, my role as a North American Jew, my role as Reuben and Gad outside the land of Israel, my role is to defend the Jews, to help Israel protect itself so that we can all be safe. That's how I perceive it. I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. I can't see it any other way. We need to keep Israel safe. And if Israelis are worried about food, I need to help them with food. And if Israelis are worried about the cost of housing, I need to help them with the cost of housing. There's not much I can do about the political situation, but I can help with the other stuff. But as we think about the question of why Israel, we know that there are actually more answers than just safety and security. Why Israel? Because this is the land that God promised to Abraham and Sarah, to Isaac and Rebekah, to Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. This is the land that God promised to us. And of course, we remember that God promised us this land, which should always be ours according to the Brit, according to the covenant, but we're only allowed to live in it when we follow the laws, when we heed the mitzvot. That covenant is clear. So our children and our grandchildren are asking us the question, what happens when your commandment to live in that land conflicts with the commandment of keeping Jews safe? As I asked one Israeli friend of mine, do you think it's worth the army presence in the West Bank? We're putting Jews on the line in order to protect land that was promised to us in the Bible. And his answer was no, it's not worth it. We should pull back. It's easier to keep ourselves safe if we pull back. The security fence has saved thousands of lives. But the Bible's clear. And in fact, you're welcome to take out your Chumashim and you can look at it. There's a map in the back of your Chumashim, and if you look to page 1512, it's the page after 1512. It's not 1513 because that would be silly to make the page after 1512 1513. But nevertheless, the map in the back of your book after page 1512 lays out the map of Israel. And what we see very clearly is the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is all in the West Bank. The land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they traversed, that they walked, that they dreamt, that they communicated with God, that land is what we call Judea and Samaria, Yehuda and Shomron. That land in which our ancestors directly encountered God is in what other people call the occupied territories. Now in Parashat Maasai, the last Torah portion of Numbers that we chanted earlier. It lays out a broader map of Israel that God promised us. It lays out a broad map of the promised land. But if we want to look at the cities in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah are really connected to God, they are in what is today the West Bank. So should we, as good Zionists who want our promised land, should we encourage, should we accept our military going in there in order to reclaim that land that is ours with all of the human cost involved? It's a question. Why Israel? What happens when our safety and our security comes into conflict with our value of settling this land, our land, the promised land? And then our children and grandchildren remind us of another answer to the question, why Israel? Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you will it is no dream, liot am choshi ba'artzenu, to be free people in our land. Part of Israel is about dreaming. The founding of Israel, why Israel? Is so that we could have a place where our prophets' messages could be lived, where Jewish people with Jewish power could be welcoming to everybody around us, where Jewish people with Jewish power wouldn't abuse the stranger, wouldn't take advantage of the widow and the orphan, where Jewish people with Jewish power could serve God in truth. So part of the challenge of why Israel is that maybe Israelis have stopped dreaming a little bit. Maybe in their worry about safety and security, maybe in their frustration over the religious settlers who want to expand back into our biblical promised land, maybe they've stopped dreaming a little bit about what a perfect moral society could look like and how we as Jews could build that society. And that's why our children and our grandchildren are asking us the question, why Israel? And of course, we're saying back, because we need to be safe. We have to protect ourselves. And they're saying back to us, yeah, but what about the dream? And we're saying, but we're not invincible yet. And they're saying you're awfully powerful, if not invincible. Why Israel? There's a story that takes place in 1860 or 1861. I think it took place in Minsk, or maybe it was in Pinsk, about a group of Jews who got together every Tuesday evening. And there, every Tuesday evening, they would come together to dream about Jerusalem. And they would talk about the climate, and they would talk about the culture. They would talk about the curriculum. And they would talk about the collective. And sure it was, there every Tuesday night they got together to dream about Jerusalem. Well, there was among these dozen or 24 people who got together every Tuesday night a man named Beryl. And Beryl was the resident nudnik. And every few weeks or so, Beryl would say, you know, you guys talk a lot about Jerusalem. Maybe you should pack your bags and move there and actually live the dream you keep talking about. And the other dozen or 24 people would say, Beryl, listen, I hear what you're saying, but it's nice here. Business is good. Life is easy. Why should we up and move to the land of Israel? And it would go on like that week after week, month after month, year after year, where they would dream about Jerusalem, and every few weeks Beryl would say, no, why don't you up and move there? Life is good here. It's easy. We're content. Sure enough, one Tuesday comes along, and one of the Jewish guys invites his non-Jewish friend to the gathering. And the non-Jewish friend sits and listens all evening, and they have a perfectly wonderful time as they do every Tuesday, dreaming about Jerusalem, the climate, and the culture, the curriculum, the collective. And the evening goes on and comes nearly to the end, when one of the guys says to the Gentile who was there all evening, he says, you know, Chris, what do you think about this? What do you think about our gathering? And Chris says, oh, it was very lovely. I enjoyed listening to you all dream about Jerusalem. It was very nice. And they said, no, no, no. You can be honest. We have a nice relationship. Tell us, what do you think? And this Gentile, we'll call him Chris, he says, you know, Jews are a good people. You're a nice people. But you really think yourselves morally superior to everybody else. You really think that your ethics and your morals, your behavior is better than everybody else. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. And the Jews got all upset. They got all upset. And they said back to Chris, yeah, well, have you ever seen us go hunting? We've never gone hunting. We're clearly morally better than the Gentiles. And Chris said back to the Jews, yeah, you've never gone hunting because we don't allow you to own guns. And sure enough, the dozen or 24 people turned in that moment to Beryl. And they said, you know, Beryl, the time has come to pack our bags, to move to the land of Israel, to build Jerusalem, and to show that even when we do have guns, we're still not going to go hunting. We live in complex times. And the answer to why Israel, well, it may have been easy 100 years ago, it may have been easy in 1945 and in 1948, it may have even been easy in 1967. The answer is not easy anymore. It's complex. And me, I approach this question with a tremendous amount of humility. But I do believe that it's our land. I do believe that our brothers and sisters are there, and we owe it to them to support them. I also do believe that when the state of Israel and its residents feel strong and secure, that is when they're most likely to pursue peace. If you look at the peace agreements that Israel has struck, it is when the United States has said, we have your back. Whether that's with Egypt or with Jordan, or most recently with the Abraham Accords. Israel has been the most peaceful when the United States has said, Israel, we have your back. And here we are as Jews living outside the land of Israel. Our first role is to ensure the safety and security of the state of Israel. And beyond that, we can, with a certain degree of humility, then encourage our brothers and sisters to begin to address the other challenging reasons for why Israel. What does it mean that this land was promised to us thousands of years ago? What does it mean that the land in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah connected to God is currently being occupied by another people? And what does it mean to live in a land, to build a state where we can truly dream about something bigger and better, about something a little more perfect, about a place where God's law, not only in how we serve God directly this way, but in how we care for God's other children, is manifested in this world. I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. But in this Shabbat of Parashat Matot-Maasai, as we see the biblical borders of the land of Israel, this Shabbat of Parashat Matot-Maasai, in which we remember the Reubenites and the Gadites, who said, yeah, okay, we're going to dwell outside the land because it's a little easier out here. But we have an obligation to ensure the safety and security of the land. This week, let us double our efforts to make sure that the United States has Israel's back. But let us also hope and pray and maybe even gently nudge and encourage that our brothers and sisters in the state of Israel should continue to dream about a time when the mitzvah of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you shall love the stranger as yourself, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your might, with all your heart, and with all your soul, truly comes into being. Let's continue to dream, my friends. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. May this be our will. And let us say together, Amen. And thank you again for the opportunity to study.